So my name is Joanna Hewitt-James. I am the Executive Director of Freedom United. And I think many of you know that Freedom United is a global community that's fighting against all forms of modern slavery and raising awareness and turning that awareness into action to build power for change. We want to see a world that's resilient to modern slavery. So welcoming the speakers and our participants. I know people are still joining as I speak, but I know we've got a lot to talk about in this webinar. So I'm going to get started, and very importantly, right, just the other week, as many of you may know, October 18th marked Anti-Slavery Day in the UK and Anti-Trafficking Day in Europe, an annual observance reminding us that the fight against extreme exploitation in the form of modern slavery is far from over. So it's also a time to reflect on the historical legacy of slavery, and particularly the transatlantic slave trade, which, of course, was driven by the UK and Europe. Now, whilst some countries, namely the UK, are quick to celebrate ending that trade, what they haven't ended are the ongoing effects, not least systemic racism, that's actually enabled modern slavery to continue virtually unchecked. And it's in this spirit of continued vigilance and action that we've organized today's webinar. So with California and Nevada on the brink of voting to ban involuntary servitude from their constitutions, we have a pivotal opportunity to bring attention to the economy of prison labor and how it operates, perpetuating slavery in the 21st century. So today we'll explore this prison labor economy, when work in prisons can be considered forced labor, and why the anti-modern slavery movement should care. So many states and countries allow forced prison labor. It cuts administrative costs, it generates profit, and some see it as a just punishment for crimes committed, perhaps not fully understanding the problematic nature of the criminal justice system. But is there something deeper at stake when we allow these justifications for forced labor to persist? Well, your engagement in this topic is crucial, and thank you very much for being here. We invite you to join us in exploring the questions and encourage you to join the discussion. You can also submit questions for our panel in there's a little chat feature. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen where you can post your questions so that we can then manage them during the event. So I am first going to introduce our panelists, and also will be taking a poll, but I want to explain a little bit about the format for today's event. So after I do the introductions, we will of course hear from our panelists, and then we'll have the Q&A session. So if you didn't send your question ahead of time, you can send your questions, as I mentioned, on Zoom. And also if you're posting on social, that's great. We're going to be posting on Twitter. Please use our handle if you want to tag us, which is at Freedom United HQ. So I'm really pleased today to be joined by Katharine Bryant, who is an anti-slavery advocate with over 15 years experience in the sector. She's Director of Operations at Walk Free. Katharine's a co-author of the Global Slavery Index, the world's most comprehensive data set on modern slavery, and numerous research publications. She's worked in counter-trafficking and child protection programming and research for international organizations in Australia, Timor-Leste, and the UK. And I'm also delighted to welcome Jeronimo Aguilar, who is a policy analyst at Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. Jeronimo helped found the Abolish Bondage Collective campaign, which has the acronym ABC, and that led to Legal Service for Prisoners with Children's co-sponsorship of the ACA 8 Prop 6, the End Slavery in California Act, the very one that we've been talking about. We're going to hear some more about it when he speaks. And he also helped train and launch similar campaigns in Wisconsin, Kentucky, Philadelphia, Atlanta, and Missouri. Jeronimo's own experience with incarceration fuels his determination to make a difference for his community and for humanity as a whole. So the first thing we will do is take a poll. And we want to ask you a question to really think honestly about how you feel about this topic. Do you think that forced labor should be allowed in prisons? We'll put a poll up on the screen that you can answer. So it's a simple yes or no response. Great, we'll end that shortly as soon as we've got enough responses. I'd like to turn to Katharine first. And for the first time, the latest Global Slavery Index included an in-depth look at the 13th Amendment's exception clause and its role in perpetuating forced labor. Can you explain how prison labor in the US fits into the global definition of forced labor, and what specific aspects of this system are most concerning from a human rights perspective?
Thanks, Joanna, and good afternoon, everybody, from a slightly grey and rainy London here. I think before I dive into the specifics around prison labour, I'm just going to give you a bit of a global picture of the different definitions that we use at Walk Free, and also that are kind of common across the anti-trafficking and the anti-slavery sector. So at Walk Free, we use modern slavery as an umbrella term to encompass types of exploitation such as forced labour as well as forced marriage. And we measure that through something called the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, which we produce every 4 years rather, with the International Labour Organization and the International Organization for Migration, 2 UN agencies. And we last released that report in 2022, and we estimated that there were some 50 million people experiencing either forced labour or forced marriage, or both of those forms of exploitation around the world. If you then drill into that, just that forced labour component of that modern slavery umbrella, so that includes commercial sexual exploitation, forced labour that may occur in the private economy, as well as forced labour that may occur as being state perpetuated, or what we call state imposed forced labour. That last piece is about 3.9 million, or nearly 4 million people globally experiencing any form of state imposed forced labour. 78% of that figure are actually male, and it represents a particularly, if you can say this, egregious form of modern slavery, because it shows that the state has failed to protect its citizens, and not only that, is actively perpetuating abuse against citizens or migrants within their own borders. So if we then look at state imposed forced labour, there's many different aspects to it. It includes things like abusive conscription. So that's where people are forced into being a conscript and performing work that isn't non-military, so might be doing some communal works or things like that. It also includes economic development outside of your normal kind of civil obligations. But actually the overwhelming majority of that nearly 4 million people experiencing forms of state imposed forced labour are actually in private prisons around the world. So that's 56% of people of that 4 million are in private prison labour. It includes people being forced to work in administrative detention or when they're on remand. It also can include forced or compulsory labour when people have participated in strikes or non-violent protest. And then it also includes this benefit for private persons. Now, the International Labour Organization actually says that prison labour can be allowed globally. This is in the international system, but there are certain exemptions that have to occur. It has to be voluntary. It has to mean that people working in prisons have to be able to access minimum wages. They have to access labour rights that is comparable to people who are working in society. But what we see with prison labour in the US, that those exceptions aren't applied. So when we look at the global picture, we know that prison labour, compulsory prison labour, occurs in countries such as Brazil, China, North Korea, Poland, Russia, Turkmenistan, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, and the United States. And as you mentioned, Joanna, in your introductory remarks, that's obviously due to the 13th Amendment. This is a legacy from the abolition of slavery with the amendment in 1865 that allows for involuntary servitude to continue and be given for an offence. In Walkfrey's opinion, this meets that definition of state-imposed forced labour. Basically, it's saying that labour law protections won't apply because effectively we're talking about a legal punishment, not labour protections that would apply for any kind of economic activity. This means that people who are experiencing forced labour in prisons don't have the right to refuse. They don't have access to minimum wages, overtime protection, the right to unionize, workplace safety. And that really opens this whole system up to abuse. So in short, we would see compulsory forced labour and compulsory prison labour as a form of state-imposed forced labour, which would then meet that definition of forced labour.
Thank you, Katharine. It's really useful to hear how US prison labour practices align with and reinforce this practice of forced labour that we see globally, and how, this isn't unique to the US, but for sure it's concerning to see how normalized forced labour is within these institutions, especially in a country that I think we more commonly would think of as championing itself as a free democracy. So, Jeronimo, let's look at how, in reality, this is playing out in California. And it's a state that's historically led the nation, of course, on progressive reforms, but where there's a fight to remove forced labor from its constitution, and that fight faces resistance. What are some of the key challenges that you face in the Prop 6 campaign, and why did it take us so long to get here?
Yeah, thank you, Joanna, and just thank you for this opportunity to share about this very, very important work. And yeah, I'm just honored to be here with you all. And so yeah, in California, we have a very, it's kind of a unique relationship with forced labor, involuntary servitude, slavery. And like you mentioned, we kind of have this reputation, and I think a very false reputation in many ways, of being this progressive kind of flank in the United States. Um, when in reality, in this particular issue, we have now been surpassed by states like Alabama, Tennessee, Colorado, states that have been, especially Alabama and Tennessee, that have been definitely historically very much to the right of California on the political spectrum, right? But when you look at California, and really this was um, the part of it that I love to really dive into and to educate folks on, is that California history has never had a constitution or a society where forced labor and involuntary servitude was not an essential part of California's economy, California's criminal justice system, its racial inequities, and all of those things. So, first of all, I'm somebody that identifies as a Chicano indigenous person, right? And so my ancestry goes back on this continent for many, many, many years. And so, as somebody that has, indigenous Native American ancestry, um, we've always known very well that this history is it's very dark, and it's very troublesome. And so when you go back to 1849, which is California's first iteration of the Constitution, this is right after, the expansionist war against Mexico in 1848, and all of those things, right? Indigenous peoples were already living in a very, very um, traumatic situation, right? They were already experiencing colonization from the Spanish. The mission system was already being, placed upon the Southwest. And so, with that said, though, Mexico had kind of had its own, wrestling with this issue, right? They had gone through their revolution. You had indigenous peoples in varying degrees kind of gaining more freedom and liberation from oppression, and trying to find their voice. with that said, after this became a territory of the United States, things very much went backwards again. And so that's not to say that indigenous enslavement didn't exist already. Again, the Spanish practiced it in a very brutal way. But when the U.S., took part of this territory, indigenous peoples were enslaved almost right at the onset. And so the exception clause was introduced in that first iteration of the Constitution. It read a little bit differently than it does now, but in essentially the same concept of involuntary servitude shall not be prohibited except for the punishment of crime. And so what you saw after that is a series of vagrancy laws that were passed. And so the first one being in 1850, so it's a year right after the 1849 first Constitution. And I also should add that the first governor of California was a man named Peter Hardeman Burnett. He was a pro-slavery, came from a family of slave owners, and one of the architects of California. He organized the first Democratic Convention in California. Was a man by the name of James Still, and he also was a pro-slavery slave owner, and he actually was he got the contract to create the first prison in California, San Quentin. And so all this history really points to that we had folks in the foundations of California really trying to figure out, okay, how do we create this system of enslavement without looking like the South and having this kind of plantation style of enslavement. And so, um, with that said, like I said, those vagrancy laws, you see the first one in 1850, which is, known as the Indian Indentured Act, but on the books it was called the 1850 Act for Government and Protection of Indians. And so very, the way that they put these things, right? Government and protection. This was a time where natives were looked at as savages, uncivilized, all of those things. So we need to govern and protect them, right? With that said, it was essentially vagrancy law that criminalized indigenous peoples just for existing, right? For being unemployed, for loitering, for spitting on the sidewalk. I mean, you name it. And so after they criminalized them with these laws, their labor would be extracted. And so you already see the system of, okay, this is how we're going to extract labor from folks without looking as, I guess, barbaric as they saw it, as the plantation style of enslavement. 1855, you see the Greaser Act, and a greaser is a derogatory name for those of would be like my um, ancestry, Chicanos, Latinos. It actually says in the statute that it's dealing with the issue of Spanish and Indian blood, and so that is the ancestry of Latinos in the United States and in California. And so, and that was the same thing. It was a vagrancy law that was aimed at a specific demographic of folks, um, in order to criminalize them and then extract their labor. I'll add too that in Los Angeles today, there's a federal courthouse, and this literally used to be a slave auction block uh, during the time of this era of you know these vagrancy laws where they enslaved folks, predominantly indigenous folks, and then later African Americans that were fleeing slavery, fleeing plantation slavery from the South, were coming to California. And then California was passing things like California had their own Fugitive Slave Act that a lot of folks don't know about. They think, oh, the U.S. had a Fugitive Slave Act. Well, California had its own, where they gave slave owners, it was supposed to be 1 year to recapture their property in anybody that ran off in California. This sunset clause continued for historians talk many, many years, where it was, not monitored. And again, it was any African American person that they could grab. They didn't have to really, as you could imagine this time, oh, how can you prove that this was your property? Oh, he was mine, here's a paper that has his name on it or whatever, right? And so they were basically essentially kidnapping, trafficking folks, and then taking them back to the South. Or in many times as well during the gold rush and stuff, there's that enslavement that was happening here in California. I want to just highlight that this was an era of enslavement in California. And so this notion that we were a free state, we've never been a slave state, is very, very, not that clear. It's very clear that we have been a slave state. And so with Proposition 6, I think that, you know, the prison population and those that have been incarcerated have really understood um, this concept of them being enslaved for many, 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 many years. And so I always like to say that, yes, the legislative fight started about 4 years ago. We started with ACA 3 and it died in the California Senate. But that was not the beginning of this fight. Those that were incarcerated, they conceptualized their oppression. They knew what it was. It was enslavement. They knew, okay, we get incarcerated. All of a sudden, we get this work ducket. We're forced into it. We got no choice. And if you don't work, you're punished. This is enslavement. And so, um, yeah, there was many uprisings, throughout California history in the prison system, strikes. Um, there was a very famous, kind of infamous event that happened in the 70s in the Marin County uprising with George Jackson's brother, Jonathan Jackson. They called this a slave rebellion. Rochelle McGee, who actually was recently released after, gosh, like 50 years incarcerated, 40, 50 years incarcerated. But they called this a slave rebellion, right? And so, again, I just want to underline that, we're really standing on the shoulders of all of those folks that we're trying to scream from behind bars saying this is enslavement. Yes, I'm incarcerated and there's many injustices within the system, but this is enslavement. We're being forced to work, we're being exploited, and our bodies are being used as a tool of economic exploitation. And so um, I think that it's been this history really educating the legislature. And I think that that's what's taken so long in California, is that California is so kind of lost in all this kind of myth of that we've been this beacon of progressive, freedom, liberation. We're not as bad as, oh, look at the South and these racist states. I think uncovering that history, educating folks, people really owning up to it, saying, hey, this is what the reality is of California. And we need to, and it's not just the old history, it's something that's still alive. It's still happening today. Over 70% of those incarcerated in California are either those of African or indigenous ancestry. They're Black or brown people, over 70%. And so you see the same populations from these laws that I mentioned from 1850 that's still happening to the next generations of these same people. And so I think that's the big thing, is that there was just so much kind of miseducation around California, that it took a long time to kind of get people up to speed. And once we did, though, I think that we made a lot of headway, but also, we're the fifth largest economy in the world. And so it's a huge economic engine for California. It always has been. And so it took a long time to also deal with those forces that don't want to, threaten that economic, that engine that they have using cheap and forced labor.
Yeah, wow. Thank you, Jeronimo. I have to say it's really is very surprising and very educational to hear how deep California's slavery history runs. And I think you're absolutely right that, there is an assumption that California is apart from the slavery system, but I feel very educated now. I really appreciate you explaining the history and the background to how we've got to where we are, which actually does point to and suggest why these interests are actually very entrenched, and defending them is also something that people even today are serious about, which I've always been confused, but I think you've set the scene for me much more clearly. Katharine, there are arguments that are made that forced prison labor has its benefits. Maybe that it's necessary for rehabilitation, reducing the cost burden of prisons, or serving justice for harm caused by the crime. How do you respond to this? And how does the persistence of legalized forced labor in prisons challenge our understanding of justice and human dignity? I mean, as citizens, what responsibilities do we have to confront and abolish this as one of the many forms of modern slavery that we see today?
Thanks, Joanna. It's a great question, and thanks, Jeronimo, as well. That was absolutely fascinating to learn some more about the legacy of slavery in California. I think the key point, if no one remembers anything else that I say today, I think that kind of underlying this is that ultimately being convicted of a crime does not mean you are stripped of your human rights. Basically, like that is the fundamental lesson I'd love people to kind of take from this, including the right to be protected from extreme forms of exploitation, including forced labor and slavery. So Joanna, your argument's interesting. So if we kind of break it into 2 points, and I'm not going to get into kind of the efficacy of prisons as a whole. I'm going to just focus on the argument that you were laying out there of like prison labor being essential for rehabilitation, and then that second part about offsetting the costs of incarceration that taxpayers often pay the burden. So if we start with that first one about prison labor or mandatory prison labor being essential for rehabilitation, I think I go back to kind of my opening remarks that actually the key part there, the key word there is the mandatory part, and removing that this idea of like consent and labor laws just somehow don't apply to people because they've committed a crime. So there is evidence that, people who've been incarcerated, want to be productive. They obviously want access to work, to skills development as part of that rehabilitation process when people exit prisons. There's evidence that studies that incarcerated people who are able to work, save money, develop skills, are then less likely to reoffend later on. So there is evidence that supports that. But again, it's that key part around it not being mandatory, and also access to any kind of decent labor rights or decent work that everybody else in the population has access to. So it's very much about legitimate work may help with rehabilitation. Mandatory prison labor does not. And that's seen very clearly through the current system. Like, obviously, we see a huge power dynamic playing out here, are completely swayed against the people who are incarcerated. They, are open to abuse completely. They may be limiting access to training, labor protections, as I mentioned, health and safety equipment. There's cases, obviously, of people being forced to fight fires, so, being exposed to extreme heat or operating dangerous machinery without the proper protection. There's been reports of people facing punishment for non-compliance with this, be it solitary confinement if they refuse to work, or being, not having access to parole, being denied with parole. There's also been some more recent cases of people having to work in order to get access to, sending text messages and accessing phone calls to loved ones, which feels completely inhumane. Ultimately, the payments that we also see across the US very specifically are incredibly low. So I think the average is less than $1 an hour if people are paid. The highest doesn't get above $3 an hour, which means obviously is below minimum wage or below any kind of living wage, and also means that people aren't actually able to save, which goes against that idea that prison labor can help with rehabilitation. On the second part of that argument about offsetting costs, I mean, in some way, yes, private prison labor in particular is hugely lucrative, but not for any kind of taxpayer benefit. It's ultimately the private prisons that themselves are actually benefiting from that. There's some studies, I think ACLU and the University of Chicago put out that per annum it's an $11 billion industry, which is insane in terms of the amount of money that it's producing. And there's been some really interesting reports coming out actually earlier this year from Associated Press about highlighting some of the private companies that are then actually benefiting from using forced labor in prisons. So McDonald's, Whole Foods, Walmart, these were allegedly associated with goods and services being produced by people being forced to work in prisons. And ultimately, all of this, I mean, Jeronimo did a much better job explaining this than I will, but just very briefly, this power dynamic, what we're seeing here is the result of structural inequality, the legacy of slavery. Jeronimo mentioned about people of color being at higher risk of these forms of exploitation. I think black men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. And this is recognized globally. The International Labour Organization, who we work with closely, has already said to the US that they need to be taking steps to ensure that compulsory labor is not used, given the entrenched racial discrimination in the criminal justice system in the US. Just briefly on your last point around citizens and kind of what can we do about it then? I think obviously governments are the ones that change laws and policies, which is why Jeronimo's campaign and the campaigns that are happening across the states are so important. There's a piece there about educating ourselves and learning about the structural inequalities that drive these forms of exploitation. But ultimately, I think for the citizens of Nevada and California, and hopefully we've got some on the call today who are listening in, the importance is voting. Ultimately, that's where you can have the most influence of actually trying to get rid of this from the Constitution. And then other states that still have these forms of exploitation in place, such as Florida, Georgia, and others, will then hopefully follow suit.
Thanks, Katharine. Super valuable points. I think your message is very clear that you don't lose human rights when you're imprisoned. And I think also the other point that you very briefly touched on, that, you know, there is a whole other 20 sessions that we could have on just the prison system in itself. You know, and even whether people are even criminal that are in there. But I mean, all of them, of course. But we are focusing very much, as you've responded very helpfully, on this aspect of coercion and forced labor. And I think you've highlighted how distorted that notion of what's required for justice and rehabilitation. So I think clearly these systems don't serve the individuals or really the society at large. And Jeronimo, of course, you work with incarcerated individuals and their families, and I'm sure you've seen the toll that this takes firsthand. Can you explain the various forms of coercion that's used in prison labor systems? Like, as Katharine explained, that it's that use of coercion that means it meets the criteria that the ILO sets out of being forced labor, and how has this impacted and incarcerated individuals' ability to make free choices about their labor?
Yes, thank you. So the prison system, and I should add, I mean, forced labor, really, it spreads throughout, you know, not only CDCR, which is the California prison system, but also jails, county jails, juvenile facilities, as well as immigrant detention centers. And so there's actually been some heightened attention on you know, these private run facilities in California. They've kind of phased away the private prisons, but there was a Ninth Circuit ruling that said that they could not ban it for immigrant detention centers. And so they've continued to run those privately here in California, groups like the GEO group, where there's just been, I mean, their history of, you know, brutality and all of these, you know, so many, you know, kind of flagrant ways that they've been abusing folks inside is well documented in groups like GEO. I mean, it's just a very horrible situation that those folks are dealing with. And yeah, recently it's been more attention being put on that they're also being forced to work and produce goods for the state, many times without any compensation at all. But to speak on you know, kind of CDCR and the way that the prison system specifically punishes folks, and you know, some of these specific examples is, so like I mentioned earlier, when you get incarcerated, you receive what's called a work ducket, which is like a, you know, piece of paper that they give you that, you know, tells you what is your work assignment. You have no choice on the matter at all. And then if you don't go, you know, for whatever reason, whether you're not feeling well, we've heard very horrific stories of you know, folks losing loved ones, going through very traumatic situations in their families, and still having to go to work, or not going to work because they're just obviously emotionally distraught, and then being disciplined for not showing up, even though they're telling them, look, I just lost somebody, I mean, I need time. Nevertheless, you know, the production is the priority, right? The money is the priority, and producing these goods and all that stuff. And so what happens if you don't show up, or, you know, is that you can receive one of the ways is that you will receive a 115, they call it, which is a rules RVR, a rules violation report. And so these go on your, on your file. And so, 95% of those incarcerated are going to be coming back home. And so, as you could imagine, you're trying to, show the system, the prison system, that you're, rehabilitated, that you're, ready to come home. And these rules violation reports just totally wreck any chances of being able to, uh, qualify once you go to the board. Once you go to the board of, what do you call it? Gosh, it's just escaped my mind.
Role.
But yes, exactly, the parole board. And so, with that said, 115 is one way. They also will take away privileges. Uh, Privileges, you should call them, really should be rights, but the right to see your family, your children, to have visits with your loved ones. Though that's one of the, you know, uh, like I said, privileges that they'll take away. Another is your access to the canteen, which is, where folks get goods and stuff. But the canteen, I like to really um, qualify this for folks, is that the canteen is not a place where folks are getting, people think of it as, oh, they're getting goodies and snacks and all that stuff. Um, what they give you as far as your hygiene and the things that you actually need, your necessities, they don't produce those things for you. It's woefully insufficient in what they give you. And so, even for those that have no support from the outside. And so you use the canteen. Most people use the canteen inside to supplement, your needs, your soap, your toothpaste, your all of those things. And so you could imagine when they're um, reducing or totally prohibiting your access to the canteen, it could actually have a direct effect on your ability to just buy necessities that you need to survive, to upkeep yourself and all of those things. So that again is another just very, um, very abusive way that they punish folks. And then with the another aspect of the 115s is that, if you get enough rules violation reports, and what they'll do is they'll put you on they'll reduce your status, right? And so you'll be put on what's called C status. And C status is basically kind of like your lowest status. You're basically at zero privilege status as an incarcerated individual, right? And so when you're on C status, um, again, all of those things that I talked about, that all of it comes into play. Your canteen, your visits, your phone, your time out in the yard, all of those things are all woefully reduced. And so you get like I said, you're in zero privilege status. And this is reserved for like your most, kind of problematic individuals inside. And so, this is like the picture we used to paint for the legislators that were like on the fence about this thing. We're like, look, you got people that are on C status for, just imagine you got a group of folks and, what did you do? Oh, well, I attacked the CO, oh, what did you do? Oh, I attacked another inmate, and I did this and that. Oh, what did you do? Oh, well, I couldn't go to work because, I lost a loved one and I couldn't show up. Or I wanted to pursue my education, and so I stopped going to work so that I can get into this other program. I mean, the fact that these folks are in the same level, or if somebody just said, I simply didn't want to do that job anymore, um, it's just ridiculous. And we see legislators' eyes open, like, wow, they get the same punishment. Yes, they do. And so it's just it's really eye-opening for folks to see the way that the prison system is disciplining, punishing folks. And this has an effect not only on the incarcerated individual, but their families as well.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. And thank you very much for sharing your personal insights. It's really powerful and troubling to see how these tactics are very damaging. And I think it serves as a reminder for us why it's so important to be committed to this issue as part of an anti-slavery agenda. We do actually still sometimes get questions from our anti-slavery community about why this issue matters. Some people feel like being incarcerated, people have chosen to give up their rights. I think, Katharine, you already addressed that. We are quite, I mean, there's so much to talk about. We are quite short of time. So I do want to ask my last question, but I also want to hear, I see there's some really great questions that are coming in as well from our participants. So just very briefly, Katharine, I think if you could pick a response, and I'm sure you have a lot to say on the question of the positioning of the US as a global leader in combating human trafficking, whilst also allowing it within its own borders, and also the potential impact of removing involuntary servitude from state constitutions like California's Proposition 6, or indeed federally, as we're calling for, and how that would strengthen the US's stance and its position as a fighter of ending human trafficking.
Yeah, of course, I can be fairly brief, so we have more time for questions as well. So at Walk Free, we produce something called the Global Slavery Index, which is basically an index of about 180 countries around the world, both in terms of the size of the problem, and also, so we rank them in terms of the size of the problem, but also rank them in terms of government responses to the issue. So globally, the US is actually seen pretty well in terms of their response to modern slavery and human trafficking. It actually has it takes the most action. There's no question around the effectiveness, just in terms of the amount of action in the Americas. And it also has the second strongest response globally. A lot kind of driving this is something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which basically set up the domestic response around strengthening criminal justice responses, set up the interagency task force to monitor and combat trafficking, among other things. But also, importantly, it did something by setting up something overseas, so which established the Global Trafficking in Persons Report, where the US produces a report in every single country around the world, giving them a tier rating, tier 1, 2, watch list, and 3. And it also ties that to funding support. So if a government doesn't meet a certain standard, the US actually prevents that particular government or country from receiving non-humanitarian and non-trade related foreign assistance. The figures are, in comparison to the amount of money being produced under the forced prison labor system, it's quite small, but the US does give around 70 million US dollars a year in terms of assistance just purely focused on trafficking. Now, this, although it has a relatively strong response, so that seems quite positive, there are obviously still huge gaps in the US government's response. On forced marriage, for example, there's no legal age for marriage across the US, meaning 12-year-olds can get married. There's very little done to tackle underlying discrimination, which I think we've talked about quite a lot today. But we also see that the entire US response is kind of completely undermined by the presence of state imposed forced labor. And that plays out into the figures that we see. So approximately over 1 million people in the US alone experience all forms of modern slavery in agriculture, sex work, domestic work, hospitality, etc., as well as in private prisons. Now, I'd argue, obviously, US, wealthiest country in terms of GDP in the world, top 10 in terms of GDP per capita. It obviously has the resources, and given this legislation and a lot of the work that's doing both domestically and internationally, it has allegedly the long-standing political will to tackle these issues. So therefore, we see no reason why the US, as being perceived as this global leader, as having a relatively strong response globally, wouldn't do more to actually eradicate state-imposed forced labor, because basically, without doing that, its entire response and its standing globally is completely undermined. And people are aware of this. As I mentioned, the UN has been holding the US to account to this for years. So it seems that it's time now for the US to actually take action on this particular issue.
Thank you, Katharine. And I think there is, of course, an opportunity for voters in California and Nevada to do just that. And we very much hope they will. However, Jeronimo, there is resistance. And there's been a barrier, of course, to progress. Just very briefly, if you could, so we can get to a couple of questions. I'd just like to hear a little bit of your view on that resistance that we're facing today. And, and I'm sure it does reflect, of course, and remind us of the resistance historically. But what can we learn and how we can persevere and move forward and get the result we need?
Right. No, yeah, the resistance has been, I think it's folks are kind of not as aching to just come out and say, hey, I'm for slavery. But at the same time, they're not as, quick to jump, onto this campaign or onto the, yes, I'm going to definitely vote for Proposition 6. And I think that through the legislature, some of the resistance we saw was there was this kind of fear of the unknown. Will this produce kind of, things that we can't foresee in the future, like, folks getting paid minimum wage inside. I mean, God forbid that. But I think that what we made clear, in the legislative fight was that they were conflating this with wages, right? And so we needed to make it very clear to folks that, to legislators in particular, that it doesn't cost a penny to give somebody the right to consent to labor. And so this has nothing to do with wages. I mean, I guess it does have something to do with wages for sure, but there's no direct correlation. You don't give somebody the consent to labor, and all of a sudden that means that you're paying them minimum wage. And we've seen this across the country in all these states that have changed. California is only one of, I think, 16 states that still has this in their constitution. But we've seen, like I mentioned earlier, Colorado, Alabama, Tennessee, and these states have removed the exception, and they have not changed wages for those that are incarcerated. And so, again, this is more about humanity, um, you know, not allowing folks to be exploited, not having this as an aspect of our criminal justice system. Because, like Katharine, very well put, like that's not a part of, when you get incarcerated, you don't lose your right to consent. The punishment is being incarcerated. You're taken out of circulation of society. You're confined to a cell. You're being told what to do. I mean, there's like so many aspects of incarceration, especially in the US, that is very, very punitive. But it doesn't also come with also your body as an economic tool to be exploited. And so I think that when we put it plainly like that, like, look, we did away with convict leasing. We said we did. But this is exactly what it is. I mean, we're forcing people to produce goods, and at the behest of these corporations, like also Catherine mentioned. I mean, all these big corporations that are now invested in, I mean, in California, all of the furniture in the college system, the UCs, all that furniture is created by incarcerated labor. All of the furniture at the California Capitol as well, and legislative offices is all created, I mean, all built by incarcerated labor. And so, folks inside here in California, they just doubled the wages. And I think that they saw us coming, that the resistance saw us coming, and they said, okay, we'll double the wages. Well, you doubled it from 8 cents to 16 cents an hour. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's like a slap in the face to think like you think that that's going to be sufficient. 16 cents an hour. So yeah, I think that the resistance, is more again around trying to protect this economic engine, but they're not like out in front either. Like, hey, pro-slavery. They're just very much like in the background saying like, oh, well, this can create some bad situations here. It could really cost the state, a lot of money. I get it. We do want to take this out of the Constitution, but we need to be careful. And I think there was the biggest thing is that folks wanted us to kind of pass a symbolic um constitutional amendment here that would just remove the language from the Constitution, but not change the practice in any way. And so we've seen that in some states as well, where they've had varying degrees of how it's actually changed the material reality of incarcerated people. One thing that we're grateful to these other states that have worked on this, because we were able to kind of see what worked, what doesn't work. And we were like hitting the table here in California saying, no, we don't want no part of anything symbolic. If this isn't going to change the material reality for our people inside, then we'll jump off this campaign. I mean, we really
Right.
want this to be more than symbolic. So
Right. No, absolutely. Very much so. Yeah, one of your points I think really ties into a question that we've got from the audience from Sandra, and I hope that perhaps Sandra and Christopher will be ready to ask their questions. But first, we are going to put a second poll to you. We're going to ask you the same question. We want to know if any perspectives have changed. But thank you so much for your insightful perspectives. It's so there's so much to learn, I think, on this subject, and there's so much for us to really be motivated and mobilized to get active and call this out and campaign for change. So I am going to turn first to Sandra, if Sandra is ready to ask a question, because it really ties into the point you're making, Jeronimo, about the value of what the actual consequences are of these this forced labor system. Sandra, over to you. No, okay, Sandra, we can't hear you, so I'll just ask the question for you. And Sandra's question is about people who are released from prison. She says, if the population is forced to work, will they not perhaps become angry and resentful? And wouldn't that hamper their assimilation back into society?
Yes, most definitely. It reminds me of a story of one of my colleagues, who was incarcerated at a very young age, 18. He hadn't had a job yet. His first interaction with the job force, with labor, was while being incarcerated, and so it very much disillusioned his kind of outlook on work. And so when he got out, it was very difficult for him to, like, you know, what does getting a job really look like? Because all I know is being forced into labor that I have no choice on. It's very exploitative, it's abusive, and all those things. And so, yes, and another thing is that rehabilitation. I mean, a lot of the opposition will say that it's rehabilitative, right? Work, labor, it's rehabilitative. Forced labor, there's no redeeming qualities in it. In fact, it takes away people's human agency.
Absolutely. Now, very true. Christopher has some very specific questions that I think again are really directed at Jeronimo. Christopher, if you could unmute yourself, you should be able to ask your question.
Okay, fine. Very well.
Thank
Okay,
you.
fine. You hearing me?
Yes, we are.
Okay, fine. The question I have is, first question I have I placed in the Q&A is, what is forced prison labor? Is forced prison labor happening in maximum security prisons in Canada? And does that happen in maximum security prisons in Canada? Also, does forced prison labor, is that happening at the supermax prisons in Florence, Colorado, and in Pelican Bay, California? Does that our prisoners?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christopher. Yeah, so quite specific locations. I don't know if there's a general policy that relates to maximum security, but I think it's an interesting question. For maximum security detainees, do either Jeronimo or Katharine?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't speak to Canada, but but what I can speak to here in California for sure. You mentioned Pelican Bay and also Colorado. I mean, I'm not for certain, but I am, pretty certain that, yeah, there's no kind of prohibition depending on, like, if you're in a supermax. I think that it depends. Sometimes there's certain individuals that may not have those opportunities depending on the security risks that the system will say that there is. But in large part, as far as in the prison itself, yes, there's still forced labor being done, goods being produced, and the prison itself being maintained by the incarcerated population.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, have any of these prisoners sued the California penal system as well as the Colorado penal system to try and end forced labor among their inmates?
Well, in Colorado, since they passed their amendment, there's a lot of litigation that's right now being filed. It's been filed throughout the last few years after Colorado was able to change their constitution. Unfortunately, here in California, I mean, there's no legs in any filing, for litigation or filing for complaints because the Constitution allows it, right? And so it's completely legal for them to force people into labor, and so there's nothing to really dispute there. But in Colorado, for sure, there's litigation that's being disputed right now.
But there
Has that
are,
has
so I was gonna say,
has that litigation proven to be successful?
Some has and some hasn't. And I guess that's what I was kind of getting to with the language earlier, right? Is that, we learned here in California that it needs to be very clear in the language that we're talking about those that are incarcerated, that they cannot be forced into labor. If you leave it ambiguous in any way, it's going to allow the courts to interpret it the way they would like to. And sometimes they could say, oh, well, this really doesn't pertain to those that are incarcerated. And so, yeah, in Colorado, that's left some folks being successful with their litigation and some not so successful.
thank you, Christopher. That's a really important question actually about litigation because there have been efforts also particularly in the space of immigration detention where people are not actually convicted of a crime. They're being forced to work. So it's even outside the parameters of the 13th Amendment, which does say very clearly that the punishment of slavery should be on conviction. So I think that's a really important point that you raised, and I appreciate that. And we have one other specific question from an anonymous attendee asking if members of the US military in brigs are appropriately paid for their work in carpentry, metalworking, groundskeeping. So is that a question that you can answer, Jeronimo? No. Okay.
I'm not sure what Briggs is that. I'm not sure where that is.
No problem. Yeah, that's fine. Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. I know there's been some really great contributions as well in the chat. A lot of experience, knowledge, and learning that's people bringing to the conversation that really supports, I think, some of these big messages that we've learned today. Jeronimo, do you want to close with a point?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to mention because the military kind of was raised, right? I wanted to add that there's a big aspect of this that those inside are being forced to produce products and things for the military industrial complex. So you got the defense contractors that are contracting with prisons to get weapons and artillery and all of these things, helmets. I mean, everything you could imagine for war created by those that are inside. So you got this interplay between the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex that is very, very troubling as well.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Jeronimo, for sharing your deep knowledge, the history, lived experience of the system, and to Katharine for the framework and the depth of the legislative and the practice around forced labor in the prison system. It's been incredibly insightful. Thank you very much to the participants for joining us for this conversation. And also to my team at Freedom United, and particularly Krista, who've helped organise this event. And we would love to continue organising events like this, and definitely encourage, if you can, to make a small donation on our website to support us in doing that. We'll send a link to a recording of this, so if you want to go back and watch it or share it, you can do that. And I think it just leaves me to say thank you to everybody very much, and we're grateful for your support, and we will be watching very closely to see the outcome of this vote in Nevada and California next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.